So I wanted to talk, I think actually what I'm going to say is incredibly resonant with what's come before, especially what Lotte said, but from a totally different angle, because I am not, I mean, I'm an educator in practice, but I don't think about it professionally. I do philosophy of art, and then I got obsessed with games. And so I'm not sure how many of you know this. The reason I'm here is that I have spent a really large amount of my life researching and giving a philosophical theory of games and the relationship of games to motivation. And one of the things that's interesting is when I talk about this, and most of this book is like a love song and ode of praise to like the wonder of games as an art form. People mostly say something like, "Oh, you love games, you must love gamification. Like, do you have a Fitbit?" And what I usually say is actually understanding what makes games good helps me understand why I'm mostly horrified by most gamifications, especially things like Fitbit and Twitter and the pervasive gamification of education. So I want to really stress the difference between two things. And I think a lot of, I don't think, I think a lot of especially would agree with me, but I think a lot of people out there don't. I think there's a huge difference between playing different games in education and the large scale gamification of education. So I think there's a massive difference between jumping in and playing different games with different points and different activities and trying them out as part of your classroom, which I do all the time, versus creating some kind of large scale achievement and reward system that mimics a game, but plugs into a pervasive and inescapable system like grades, like anything that would be used to evaluate job performance. So so just to make language clear, I'm just always going to talk about playing games in education, which I'm very for, and then the gamification of education, which is some kind of large scale integration of a game with grades and the evaluation of performance. And I basically at this point think that stuff is evil, and I'm going to try to show you why.
Mhm.
Um, the basic central idea is that play, I think, is crucial, and much of play is about the transition between different valuing systems, different forms of activity, and different perspectives. When you play lots of different games that have different relationships and different point systems in succession, what you do is transition across a broad variety of mindsets. If, on the other hand, as educators, we offer a highly gamified system that in every class orients people towards one pervasive point scoring system, like grades, right? I think that's actually the opposite of play, because instead of permitting transition between different mindsets, it's emphasizing one pervasive, inescapable, well-defined value system. So those to me are very different approaches to games in education. So in the background, a lot of what I want to say depends on understanding how games work, just games by themselves, separately from education. So I want to just give you uh, a quick overview of my theory. So if you want, I'll put it in the chat later. There's an article version that's online. There are blog post versions. There's the books. But basically, my idea is so I started studying games. A lot of people are trying to defend games and say that games are important by comparing them to other art forms, by saying, "Oh, they're important because they can be like movies, or they can tell stories, or they're kind of fiction." And what was interesting to me is if you read through a lot of these books, you can read literally like 20 books by scholars on the importance of games and have them not mention freedom, play, choice, decisions, or skill. Right? It's all about how they're like fictions or tell stories. So I wanted to figure out what made games special. So my theory is basically that games are the art form that work in the medium of agency. Games specify different kinds of agency, and when you play a game, you step into an alternate agency. So a lot of people, I mean, people want to say it's games create a different environment. They do that, but that's not all of it. People want to say that games create specific affordances. They give you different things to do, right? Skills and abilities. That's part of it, but that's not the whole story. I think the most crucial. So my favorite designer in the world for games is Rainer Knizia, a German board game designer. Some of you may know his work. And he says, there's an interview where he says, the most important thing in the game designer's toolkit is the scoring system, because the scoring system tells you what to care about during the game. It sets your motivations during the game. So this makes sense. So the way I think of it is A game designer creates a skeletal agency that includes abilities, but also motivations. And you just pick it up. You open up the game and it tells you, am I trying to kill other people? Am I trying to cooperate with them? Am I trying to cooperate with these people to get those people? Am I trying to collect money? Am I trying to kill all the wolves? Like whatever, right? You just learn and then you care about it. And you step into it and then you step out of it. So an interesting thing for me is, and this is very specific, when you play lots of games, and we're not talking about gamification. When you play lots of games, I think this is an autonomy building exercise because it exposes you to a wide variety of different forms of agency and practical styles. And that can build, that's exposure, right? Like any other exposure to wide varieties of perspectives, it can build your inventory. If, on the other hand, we stick someone in one game forever, that's the opposite effect, right? Because they're not getting exposed. Crucially, one of the things I think that's the great pleasure of games is something I want to call value clarity. So in normal life, figuring out what's important is fucking hard, right? Like there are tons of values, they conflict with each other, they're hard to measure, and even individual values are hard to apply. So I'm trying to be a good parent. I have a 4-year-old. I went upstairs last night and my 4-year-old had ripped all his books off the shelves and was like dancing in them with his clothes off. And I was like, am I letting this child be happy or am I creating an undisciplined monster? I don't know. Like, how do I tell if I'm being successful, right? And add to that the trouble of comparing that with the values of health, the values of work, all these things, it's hard to commensurate them, right? Real life is nauseating. But games offer you this momentary existence where what you want to do is absolutely clear, it's specified, there's no ambiguity about what you want to do. There's no ambiguity about how well you've done. And there's no ambiguity about the evaluative metric, right? So games offer a kind of existential balm. They're like relief from like the nauseating existential horror of the world. So this is part of my theory. So, side point, one of my worries about games is, so a lot of people worry that games will make serial killers or bring about violence. I think a lot of the research shows that doesn't actually happen. I'm actually worried that if games, the most dangerous thing about games is that it might inculcate the sensibility of expecting values to be hyper clear and quantified. And if that's true, what we should worry about is games making Wall Street bankers, right? Like games making people that expect the world to be hyper clear. So that's my theory of games. So notice one key part of this. Part of the pleasure of games is the artificial narrowing of values to make them hyper clear. So if you want to gamify an element of life, what you need to do to bring that pleasure and fun and motivation is to artificially narrow and hyper specify the target. And I'm really worried about what happens when we do that outside of games, because games are, as I think most of you know, a closed box. You walk into them, you step back from them. You close the game and you step away from it. So sometimes I worry a lot about Fitbit, but I've written a paper that's up online called How Twitter Gamifies Communication. And I think Twitter is a really good case study because we can come to communication with all kinds of motivations, with rich and variable motivations. We can be interested in understanding each other, having empathy, learning, connecting, but none of those are scored by Twitter. Twitter is a game. It offers a point system. People find it really exciting. I find it really exciting. I find it quite addictive and thrilling. But to make it addictive and thrilling, you have to buy into the point system. And the point system measures one thing, which is popularity, right? Likes and retweets and follows are measures of popularity, not understanding or empathy. And part of that is, it's not like Twitter set out to narrow our values for communications, but it needed a point scoring system. And a point scoring system in a technology like Twitter depends on measuring something that is mechanically measurable by a mass produced technology. And I think a lot of the times in these situations, you see this transition where like Twitter can't measure empathy, it can't measure connection, but it can measure someone clicking like or retweet, right? And so the system of point it offers us is going to be specified partially by what's capable for a simple mechanical technology to measure. And so to get that motivation, we have to align ourselves with the value system that's there in part because it's the kind of thing that can be mechanically measured, or, and P.S., in the background. I say, or it's the kind of thing that can easily fit on a spreadsheet for a large-scale educational institution, right? So one of my worries about large-scale gamification of grades is that grades are there not because they track the thing that's the most important, but because they're a digestible form that's trackable through a large-scale institution that depends on spreadsheets. And when people internalize that, part of what they're internalizing is a system that's built to fit spreadsheets. So that's a big background worry for me. So I'll be more specific in a second, but let me be wax philosophical for a second. So one of my big worries from this, from the philosophical side, and I think a lot of basically said the same thing, but let me give you the philosopher's version of that. So one way to put it is there's a phenomenon I want to call value capture. And value capture is when normally your values are rich and subtle and up for your determination, autonomous determination, and then you get put in an institutional environment that presents you with simplified, typically quantified versions of those values, and they start to take over, and that's what you start to care about. So examples include citation rates for academics, grades, Twitter, clicks for journalists, right? Talking to my friends who are in journalism, like the degree to which clicks has any kind of ranking system. So my worry is that in these cases, the natural process of autonomously deliberating about what values work for you and fit with your psychology and your place in the world is displaced by an external measuring system. So one of the interesting things I found in my life with exercise is you try out different exercises and you do this thing where you figure out how it feels for you. And one worry I have is that something like a Fitbit, a step counter, pushes away the process of self-determination of values and substitutes instead the thrill of being measured, but in a way that you can't control, right? In a way that's there because that's what the technology can count. So one way to put it is, here's my TED Talky slogan. In value capture, you outsource the determination of your values. Instead of picking them for yourself and tailoring them, you buy them off the rack from like fucking Facebook, which is really worrisome to me. And of course, like my worry for educators is there are more and more temptations to become a wing of this and to offer our students the possibility of outsourcing their values to something because it works well for bureaucratic spreadsheets and doesn't emerge from their deliberation. So there's actually a huge amount of really good empirical work on this that I just want to talk about for a little bit. So my favorite book from this is Wendy Esplin and Michael Sauter's book, Engines of Anxiety. And I highly recommend this book to every educator. Let me see if I have it on my shelf right here. Oh, yes. While I'm at it, this is my games book. Haha. Okay, this book is maybe the most important book about the educational system I've read in like forever. I read this on a plane and I was like gasping in horror and shrieking. And the person next to me thought I was reading a horror novel. And I said, no, I'm actually reading a sociologist's account of the bureaucratization of the educational system. So Wendy Esplin is the kind of reigning sociologist of quantification. And this is a book that is a 10-year study that she and Michael Sauter did of what happened to the legal education system when the US News and World Report started issuing the law school rankings. What they say is everything changed. Right? So before this, one of the interesting things they say is law schools used to have radically different missions with different values. And there was no like ranking. Before the US News and World Report, there wasn't a ranking. And different places pursued different missions. And this is what's really interesting. They have lots of field recordings of prospective law students deciding which law school to go to. And the way that those law students did it is they had to figure out what they cared about an education, about a legal education. They had to figure out whether they wanted money or to be a theorist or to be in the Supreme Court or whether they wanted to do social justice or they wanted to serve the community. And the most incredible thing is what they record is that after the US News and World Report rankings come about, prospective law students stop thinking about what they care about a legal education. They take their goal to go to whatever school is best, and that's just set. So in my language, they are outsourcing their values for their education and lives to US News and World Report, right? They are no longer going through the process of value deliberation. So in the background, I also think one of the things you can really learn from the sociology and history of quantification is why we have things like grades at all. One thing that I think, sometimes I say this to educators and it blows their minds. I mean, you know this because I know that you've been talking about this. It blows students' minds. You could have school without letter grades, right? I could tailor my comments to my students depending on their interest, emotional state, and profession. I don't actually need to rank them against each other, right? So where do unified letter grades and quantified grades come from? One of, I think, the best texts, do I have this right? Oh, yes, I do. So this entire field seems to fall from this book, which I highly recommend. This is Theodore Porter's Trust in Numbers. This is a historian who actually read a bunch of philosophy of science, especially from a guy named Ian Hacking. And this book kind of starts this entire field like 2 decades ago. So he's really interested in the difference between quantitative knowledge and qualitative knowledge. And he's not against either. He thinks they're good for different reasons. But he thinks that qualitative knowledge is context sensitive and very sensitive to the particular needs of a particular environment, but it doesn't travel well between people with different backgrounds. That's qualitative knowledge. Quantitative knowledge strips off all the bits that you need a lot of background knowledge to understand, and then compresses just the invariant part so it can travel easily between large scale levels of an institution, between distant administrators with no context. There's this, by the way, there's this incredible example he has, which he says that in England, we used to measure land in a measure called the hide. And this is interesting because it's a measure, but it's a context sensitive measure. So the hide is the amount of land required to feed an average family. So notice that a hide is highly fluctuatable depending on the environment. So hide by a river is really small, and in a forest is medium, and on a plain is big, and on the desert is huge. But it's a very functional measure, right? So if a king says, give every soldier 2 hides of land, that tracks what matters. But the determination of the hide cannot be done at a centralized administration. It's always determined at the local periphery. And so when you get centralized administration, says Porter, you get this transition from hides to acres. And acres are less sensitive, less informational, less context rich, but easy to administrate from a distant center. So, okay. Okay, a few more things. So here's my big worry. This will get even more philosophical. There's one more. Do I have it? Yes, I have all the books here. I just reorganized my basement so I can show you all the books. This is, I think, the other really important book in this space. This is Seeing Like a State by James Scott. I think some of you know this book. I see you laughing. So James Scott is also in this tradition, and his view is basically like large-scale institutions and states, corporations, governments, all of this, can only see and process what can be put into the kinds of mechanical standardized measurements that they can process through large-scale bureaucratic centers. And so they only can see the parts of the world that can be put in that kind of information. And so they have a reason to remake the world into a format that they can see. And I literally am worried that gamification is the educational wing of this, and getting our students to care about GPAs is the state transforming students into something that they can see and manage because all their desires fall into a line with what the state can measure on a large scale. So there's my big humanities scholar paranoid worry. So let me get back to, I've got a few minutes left. So let me get back to the specifics of education and games. So basically my worry is that playing games encourages people to try out different values and different ways of actions, but that trying out involves a variety and going into them and stepping back from them, setting aside the value and evaluating it. The pervasive gamification of something like GPA involves presenting students with a lifelong immersion in a single non-flexible game and non-negotiable value system that they're encouraged to internalize, which I think discourages them from autonomously developing what they care about. Exactly what Lade was talking about, right? One way to put it is that Marina Lagones, who's one of my favorite theorists of play, says that what playfulness is holding values lightly enough to be able to shift between different perspectives. And I suspect that the experience of someone who's in a pervasive metrified environment, be that metric GPA, be that metric money, be that metric citation rates, is going to be the opposite of holding a value lightly. That's all I have to say. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.